When will these things be? That's a question that Jesus' disciples ask him in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. And they ask a question about when will be the end of the world, according to the Old King James. Many people look at Jesus' prophecy in Matthew chapter 24 of wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilence as signs of the times of the end of the world. Signs of the times we look for. Current events point to the imminent return of Jesus Christ. This book was written 40 years ago. Do the prophecies of Matthew chapter 24 give us signs that Jesus is coming back in our generation? When will these things be? Our generation? Some future generation? Or did Jesus tell us that this was actually going to take place in their time? Hi, I'm Pastor Jeff Hartman, Troy First Baptist Church in Troy, North Carolina. And last week we began a 14-part study in Matthew 23, 24, and 25, what is often called the Olivet Discourse. It is Jesus' main teaching on prophecy and the future. Many people claim to know the signs of the times, and they know all about wars and rumors of war. But I think they don't understand Matthew 24 that we come to tonight. I think they misunderstand the answers that Jesus gave his disciples because they misunderstand the questions that the disciples asked Jesus. And I think this is a very key study. Last week we began with Matthew chapter 23, which is certainly the context for Matthew chapter 24. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is condemning those scribes and Pharisees. And he says at the end of Matthew 23, "Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation," the near generation, that generation then. Not that generation in the future, but the near one. In Matthew 24, he closes with, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." And so Jesus was talking to that generation at that time, the near generation, and he predicted some very specific things, specifically the destruction of the temple. Which generation? We concluded last week that he was talking about that generation. When he said this generation, he meant that generation, the one that was hearing him. Tonight we come to Matthew chapter 24, and I want to look at those questions that his disciples asked, 3 of them, but it's framed with our title, "When Will These Things Be?" As he sat on the Mount of Olives, chapter 24, verse 3, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Question number 1. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? A better translation than the King James, the end of the world. What are the questions they're asking so that we can understand the answers that Jesus gives to them? First of all, let's look at the context of their questions, which would be Matthew 23, we looked at last week, and the context is in verses 1 and 2, when they ask and where they ask. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Then, after Matthew 23, Jesus went out and departed from the temple that he just told them he was leaving desolate. And his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. They had just left the temple. Jesus is leaving it literally and figuratively. And the disciples turn around and say, "Whoa, look at that temple. Look how beautiful it is." Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." So the context of these questions in verse 3 is them leaving the temple and Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple. Note, first of all, that it's not the multitudes that he talked about in chapter 23. It's not the scribes and the Pharisees. It's just Jesus and his disciples leaving. But notice the context in verse 1 is Jesus and the disciples are departing from the temple. This is Tuesday, the same day as John chapter 12. It's in the morning. And as they leave the temple on this momentous day, Jesus has just talked about leaving this house desolate because of his people's unfaithfulness to him. But his disciples want him to turn around and admire the beauty of this building. These are country boys who are impressed with the big city. And this building was very impressive. People who saw it described it as shining like the sun, as the sun would reflect off the gold. It was started in 20 BC. This is now 30 AD, 50 years later, and so the building is relatively new. It's newer than our church building, which is over 60 years old. It wouldn't be finished until 64 AD. But just as Jesus predicted, it would be destroyed, leveled, not one stone left upon another, just 6 years later in 70 AD. If we look at the same context in Mark chapter 13, as Mark tells it, we read, "Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here.'" These are very impressed people, and they want Jesus to see. The blocks that Jesus is talking about being knocked off of one another are not little bricks. They were 40 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 18 feet high. You can see these blocks at the Wailing Wall. It looked very permanent to them. It looked very secure as well as beautiful. It was titanic in its size. It was titanic in its beauty. You remember the Titanic was supposed to be the ship that God himself couldn't sink. But here is the building that they thought was beautiful and would last forever, and it would not outlast them. So this is the context. They are leaving the temple, Jesus literally and figuratively, but they want Jesus to turn back and to see this beautiful temple. And so, notice the context is they're leaving the temple, and in verse 2, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Here's Jesus' stunning prediction. You think this is something? By the time you die, most of you, this is going to be gone. It's going to be leveled. Now, there is some reference to the Old Testament here. I think Jesus has in mind the text in Haggai 2:15, where the prophet Haggai said, "Now carefully consider from this day forward, from before stone was laid upon stone in the temple of the Lord." He's talking about the construction of the temple, not this one, but a previous one. But now Jesus is talking about the deconstruction of the temple. It's not just going to crumble. It's going to be knocked down intentionally, so there won't be one stone upon another. Jesus is also referring to something that he's been talking about for a long time. Early in his ministry, he said in John chapter 2, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." One of the first things he does is talk about the temple being destroyed. He's not going to. He's telling them, you will. They don't. They cause it. It will actually be Rome that knocks down the temple. But Jesus has been talking about the destruction of the temple for 3 years now. Now there is only one interpretation. Jesus is talking about this temple. He's talking about his body. But there are many applications, and the application can also be that temple or anything that we build today. But remember, this was literally fulfilled in those days. In one generation, if you call that 40 years, we see that just as Jesus predicted in the last chapter, "I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation in that day." And as he will end this chapter saying, "Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." These things including the destruction of that temple then, Herod's temple. It did take place literally in their generation. So that's the context of their 3 questions. Now let's look at the content of those 3 questions. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, there he is, sitting down. The disciples ask him, "Look at the temple," and then they say, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. They're not really three questions. As we study this, we'll find out they're really three ways to ask the same question. When will these things be? But let's look at them one at a time. First of all, let's look at when will these things be? The very first part of their question. When will these things be? Will they be soon? Will they be thousands of years from now, like 2021? Will they really come upon this generation? They want to know, okay, what are you talking about? Something that's going to happen to us? Something that's going to happen during our grandchildren's lifetimes? Or in 2021? When will these things be? Remember that he ended the last chapter about this generation. I think these things has to refer to what Jesus predicted. They said, look at the temple. He said it's going to be destroyed. I think these things, they're talking about the destruction of the temple, right? They're not talking about the end of the world, at least yet. We'll get to that in a moment. But these things we have to assume they're talking about the destruction of the temple. As they're looking at it, and Jesus is predicting that it's going to be leveled. These things probably talks about that temple and its destruction. And when we see these things, I want you to see the way that Jesus uses it in this chapter. In the last chapter, he said, we already read it, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. In the immediate context, these things does mean the destruction, the desolation of that temple. Later on in this chapter, 24 verse 6, he says, all these things must come to pass, but that's not it. All these things does not mean the end of the world. It's not immediate, but it is soon. It will be in that generation. It will be something that they will probably live to see. But again, notice that phrase, all these things. Do you not see all these things? Well, we see that in Matthew 24:3, in Matthew 24:2. We see it in Matthew 24:6. We see it in Matthew 24:33. When you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. What is? Well, we're going to see. But all these things, probably the destruction of the temple. And one more time, Matthew 24:34, we've already looked at it, this generation. All these things will take place during this generation. When we think about these things, we have to assume that they're asking about the destruction of the temple and that Jesus is answering, talking about the temple. And up to this point, that makes perfect sense. They've asked about the destruction of the temple, and Jesus answers, this generation, and that temple was destroyed in that generation in 70 AD. But they asked a second question, and that's where the confusion might come in. What will be the sign of your coming? Now, this is a confusing question, especially when you consider their context. When they ask about his coming, what are they asking about? They ask, what will be the sign of your coming? Let's first of all look at the word sign. When they are asking for a sign, what will be the sign of your coming? I want to ask, why are you asking for a sign? Jesus has roundly condemned the request for signs. In Matthew 12:38, the scribes and Pharisees says, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. That would be Jesus' death and resurrection, being buried 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. I'll give you one sign. Kill me and I will rise. If the disciples didn't get it then, Jesus said it again in Matthew 16 to the Pharisees and Sadducees. They tested him, asking for a sign from heaven. He said, verse 4, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah, he says again. If Jesus is so much against a sign, why are the disciples asking for a sign? In spite of that, I want you to know that Jesus stoops to give them a sign. Later on in this chapter, verse 30, he says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. What does that mean? When we get to verse 30, we will explain it. But at this point, we have to assume they know it's not good to ask for a sign, but Jesus gives them one. It may not be seeing the Son, it may be seeing the sign, but why did they ask for a sign? And the other question that's troubling for me, even more than that, we can assume they forget that. Why would they ask about his coming when he was already there? He came at Bethlehem 30 years earlier, and they didn't even believe that he was going anywhere. When he said he was going somewhere, they said, "Oh, no, far be it from you, Lord. No, no, no way." So here I want to ask not about the sign, but I want to ask about the coming. Why would they ask about his coming? When we put ourselves in their shoes, this question doesn't make much sense. He's already there. We assume second coming, but they don't think he's going anywhere. So why would they ask, if you put yourself in their shoes, why would they ask, "When are you coming again?" "Well, I'm already here. Why are you asking?" If you think about it, they didn't expect him to die. When Jesus warned them numerous times, "I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be crucified," they didn't hear it. They didn't expect him to die. After he died, some of his disciples said, "We were hoping that he was going to be the one to redeem Israel," but obviously that was not going to come to pass because he's dead now. Indeed, besides all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Luke 24:21. They weren't expecting Jesus to die. They were surprised. They were shocked. They were disappointed, depressed. They all ran. They not only didn't expect him to die, they didn't expect him to rise. They weren't waiting at the tomb on the third day for Jesus to show up. No, we read in Mark 16:11, when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they didn't say, "Yeah, I knew that was going to happen." They didn't even believe it when it happened. After that, he appeared in another form to two of them as they walked and went into the country, and they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. They weren't expecting him to rise. So why would they expect him to come back if they didn't expect him to die or rise? Or even after he rose, they didn't expect him to leave. When he did show up, they were glad. But in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, they came together and they asked him, saying, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" They didn't expect him to go to heaven. They were shocked when he went up to heaven. They stood there waiting for him to come back down. And the angels appeared and said, "No, he's going to come again, but you may not see that." They didn't expect him to die. They didn't expect him to rise. They didn't expect him to leave. So why would they expect him to come again? Now, so it's a weird question for them to ask, but I want to look at that word "coming" for a moment. Your coming. There are two different Greek words that are translated "coming" in our Bible, and I want you to learn them. Maybe you've heard them referenced if you've ever heard some preaching or read a book on the second coming, the rapture, Christ's second return. There is one parousia, which means technically presence as opposed to absence. Your appearance. It is a technical term that is used for the visit of a dignitary like the king. Your coming. We are so glad that you are here. Your appearance. Thank you for being with us. It is more about being there, presence. The other word, erchomai, is kind of a verb, which means coming or going, depending upon, it's talking about proceeding. And it is literally arriving as opposed to departing. So I go to the grocery store and I come to the grocery store when I'm there, but it's not an appearance. You make an appearance on a TV show, or you can even make an appearance on a radio show, although that's a contradiction of terms. There are two different words. What you should know is they ask, when will be your parousia? When will be your appearance? So they're not asking for him to come again. They're asking, when are you going to show everybody who you are? This is the question they ask. What will be the sign of your parousia? Your showing up, your appearing, and telling everybody who you are. They're asking really about his kingdom. I want you to see the way that the word erchomai is used. In Matthew 16:28, Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming," erchomai, going, "in his kingdom." Now that is, quite literally, that generation, because someone there is going to actually see this. This is not the second coming, because no one living then is still alive now, let alone when Jesus comes again. He says, some here will see the Son of Man erchomai. Erchomai here doesn't mean Jesus' second coming. Or in Matthew 24:30, he says, then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming, erchomai, different word than they ask. What will be your parousia? He says, my erchomai, on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So when he answers the question in Matthew 24:30, he's talking about not his parousia, but his erchomai coming. And is that in the first century as well? And if we look at Matthew 26:64, when he is talking to his enemies, he's talking to the high priest who is questioning him. He says, it is as you said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming, erchomai, proceeding on the clouds of heaven. He's talking to that man in that generation and that day, the high priest, and saying, you will see me, the Son of Man, coming, but coming where? Coming to heaven? Coming to earth? Well, we'll get to that later on. But right now understand that this word erchomai, these three times at least, is probably referring to the first century and not the end of history. But if we look at the other word, parousia, which is what they ask, it's your appearance, it is your acknowledging who you are. Notice how that one is used. Your parousia is how he uses the word in Matthew 24:27. As lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming, the parousia, of the Son of Man be. So when Jesus comes, does this mean second coming? We don't know yet. But notice that this coming is like lightning. So I would suggest, what's lightning like? It's quick, it's noticeable, it's not secret, and it's destructive. Lightning doesn't construct things, it destroys things. And so lightning is what he describes his coming as, his parousia, and it's quick, noticeable, and destructive. He also uses it later in this chapter in verse 37, as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming, the parousia, of the Son of Man be. In the days of Noah, what happened? A flood. Was the flood secret, quiet? No. It was quick, it was noticeable, and it was destructive. He refers to it in verse 39 when he says, they didn't know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming, the parousia, of the Son of Man be. So in those three instances, in this chapter, the coming is not a secret rapture that nobody notices taking place. It's not quiet. It is quick, it is noticeable, and it's destructive. So when we talk about erchomai or parousia, both of them seem to be referring to that destruction of the temple, something that takes place in that generation, and not a secret rapture, but something that is quick and noticeable and destructive. So there is our question, what will be the sign of your coming? But here is the third question, and perhaps the most troubling in the King James, and what will be the sign of the end of the world? Now, I like the translation we're using now, the New King James translation, much better. What will be the sign of the end of the age? That gives us a better translation, a better understanding of what they are asking. But I want you to see how Jesus uses this word age. Jesus in Matthew 12:32 says, anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven him, either in this age or in the age to come. Now you could say in this world or the world to come, but world gives us the idea of planet, maybe. Age gives us the idea of time. And so he says, not in this time or the next time. And so the way they understood this age to be, they understood history to be divided into two great eons, two great ages. And it would be this age and the age to come. And so he wants us to see here that there is this age and there is an age to come. He also refers to it in the next chapter, Matthew 13:39. The enemy who sowed them, this is the parable of the harvest. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so will be at the end of this age. This age means there is another age. So it's not talking about the end of the world. It is talking about the end of the age, and we have to understand that to understand what Jesus is actually talking about at this point. And so I want you to see that this is the word eon. I used that just a minute ago. The Greek word eon is what we get our word eon from, and it means a time, an age. It's not the end of the world, which is another Greek word, cosmos, from which we get cosmonaut and cosmetics, believe it or not. Jesus used the word world when he says, what if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Or in Matthew chapter 24:21, when Jesus refers to the tribulation since the beginning of the world and not after that. Or John 3:16, God so loved the world. It is not the planet, the rock we live on, but the people who live on it. That is the word cosmos. But the word eon, the Greek word age, is what they are asking about in Matthew 24. What will be the end of this age? We expect a new age. What will be the end of this age? And we see that in Acts 1:6. Now are you going to restore your kingdom? Remember, they weren't expecting him to leave. They were expecting him to stay and to start the dawn of the new age, their view of the millennium. What I want you to see here is they expected not the end of the world. That's not what they were asking about. They were asking about the dawn of the new age. They couldn't wait for the new age, not the new age that we think about today with mysticism and crystals, but the new age. It would be their golden age when God reigned on the earth. And so I want you to see what they're asking. They're not asking about the end of the world and Armageddon and destruction. They're asking about the destruction of the temple, but the dawn of the new age. Jesus here is probably not talking about the end of the world. When we look at what he says in the chapter, he says in verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Is that a sign of the time that the world's coming to an end? If that was true, you could say that of any time since Jesus was on earth. Are there wars and rumors of war now? Yes. More than other times? Not compared to World War II or World War I, not compared to the 100-Year War a few centuries ago. You will hear, be sure you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Jesus doesn't want them to get all excited. The world's going to end, the world's going to end. He wants them to say, when you see all these things, specifically wars and rumors of wars, he says that's not a sign that the world is coming to an end. That's just normal human history in this fallen world we live in. He uses the word the end later in verse 13. He says, he who endures to the end shall be saved. Does that mean you have to live longer than Methuselah until the end of the world? No. You have to live to the end of the age if you endure. If you endure and you live long enough, you might see that new age that will come to pass in your generation. He says in Matthew 24:14, the very next verse, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Actually, the gospel was preached across the then known world, the Roman Empire, in Paul's time, and the end of the world didn't come in those days, but the end of that age, we believe, did come. Jesus even uses this in the very last phrase of Matthew 28:20. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He wants us to know that the temple will be destroyed, but life will go on. The temple was destroyed before, in 586 BC, was rebuilt, and would be destroyed again. But that is not the end of the world. They thought maybe the destruction of the temple would be the end of the world, or maybe they thought it would be the dawn of the new age. But here is what we need to learn from these questions that they asked to Jesus, which will tell us a lot about the answers that he gives. When he gives signs of the times, he's not necessarily giving us signs that the end of the world is nigh. He's telling us these things are going to happen. Don't expect the world to end in the next 5 minutes because you see a war declared. Don't expect it to be the end if you're a Democrat and Trump is elected, or if you're a Republican and Biden is elected. That's not the end of the world. When Jesus gives us these signs, he's not giving us a sign of the end of the world. So when Chicken Little prophets out there say, it's the end of the world, we need to make sure we understand the questions that they ask and know that Jesus is teaching us it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. That's the message of Matthew 23 and 24. It was the end of that age. But there is much more to come in our 12 following studies in Matthew chapter 24. Join us to find out what Jesus answered these questions with. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for revealing to us your plan for the ages. Thank you for Matthew 24 and 25 to come. Help us to understand them. Help us to be excited about your return, but help us to be fruitful and productive in the time that we do have. Help us not to be overworked because we are sure that the end of the world is at hand. Help us to live as if you might come tomorrow, but to work and to plan as if you won't come for 10,000 years. For in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Join us again next week. Thank you.